What is up, Thrive fam? CJ Finley here again with another episode of the Thrive on Life podcast. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a minute. I have not released an episode with a guest since April. I released one solo episode in June. This is the longest I've ever taken off from producing this show since it started back in, I believe, 2018, 2019. It's been a while, so I don't even remember the exact year it started, but it was April of that year. And I decided April of this year that I was going to take a break. So about 4 years in, I reflected on the show and loved what I had done with it over the time frame, but realized that I wanted to take a little bit of a break to understand more of the direction I wanted to take this in. I'm a big believer that direction matters more than speed. It's one of the quotes that I say to myself all the time, and there's just so much truth to it. The tortoise always wins the race, and it's one of those things in life that it can feel really good to go fast and to be busy, but a lot of times what ends up happening is you go nowhere fast. You get addicted to the feeling of the doing rather than what is the result that's happening. And when I was thinking about the podcast, the results that I really cared about, two things: great conversations. So I got to connect with other people that I was chatting with, and those conversations would then be valuable enough to spark other conversations that happen behind closed doors, whether it was between me and somebody else that listened to the podcast, or the guests shared the podcast and somebody reached out to them and they had a conversation. Really, that's the result I was looking for. And for a long time, that was extremely fulfilling. But when my son was born last year, I realized that I had too much on my plate, and I was putting a lot of energy into the podcast, and the results that I was getting from the podcast, which was initiating and sparking those conversations and helping make an impact on other people. But it got to the point where I wasn't really fulfilled with that result anymore. I was losing the obsession of producing something that I was proud of, and that started to cause internal conflict. So I decided to press pause in April and really take a step back and ask myself, why was I feeling that way? And there were several reasons. The one that I think will hit home most with other people is that there are seasons in life. And I started realizing that because I had a new constraint with my son, it was a lot of friction to try and get guests on the show, to be spending a lot of time in the calendar. And if someone canceled, I would have to reschedule. And it just wasn't what I wanted it to be. And normally I'm the type of person that with the podcast, I want it to be very low stress environment, meaning if someone has to show up late, that's okay with me because I want this show and this episode to be the best possible. So if something happens and they got to change, that's okay. But when you have the new variable of a child, changing of schedules and the stress that you take on to do each project that you have becomes intensified. And that's really what happened with the podcast. So I took a step back and I was asking, well, if I was going to do this again, how do I do it in a more frictionless way? One way is to do them virtually. I was hesitant to do that for a very long time because you just don't get the same feeling as you do in person. I love creating a really good vibe in person and spending half an hour talking to the person before the podcast and then half an hour after the podcast, because it's all about building relationships and sparking those connections for me. But if I had to have the constraint of putting my son over the podcast, which I'm always going to choose 10 out of 10 times, then I need to take a step back and ask myself, do I truly want to still podcast? And the answer is yes. So then maybe I have to go virtual. So I've worked on creating a virtual environment that I'm proud of. I now have the 4K set up. I'm working on getting my mic set up properly and in the right position. Even on this episode, I'm doing it virtually and testing the system before I do it with a guest. And it's something that I've found that spark again. I'm reinvigorated to put energy towards this. I'm going to work with a buddy of mine on sprucing up behind me right now to make it look a little bit better and just create a virtual environment that I'm proud to put out. My physical environment I'm already proud of, and that's where I'm going to jump more into episodes with my wife. And when I think about less friction with podcasting, I still want to do podcasting. Maybe it just has to be less about the guests that I'm bringing on and more about the craft of actually podcasting in this season of my life. And that's what we're going to do. My wife and I are going to respin up this podcast, create a series with ourselves, and then that way it's on our own time and our own dime to get these episodes out. Now, don't get me wrong. I am still going to focus on having guests on the show, but it's going to be a more sporadic thing. It's not going to be the entire focus. Instead, I'm going to focus on topics and valuable educational pieces that I'm going through, that I'm learning right now, that I can share with others. And I can do it in a solo manner. I can do it with my wife as we sit down live here in person. And then I can do it virtually with guests that don't live here in Austin, Texas. And then every once in a while, I can bring somebody into the studio and rev a podcast here in Austin. A lot of the reasons that I'm sharing this with you in the first place is I feel that we put this internal pressure on ourselves to keep going and doing things, even if it's detrimental to our lives. And any addict will know this. I've struggled with alcohol and marijuana in the past, and work can be the same way. You work so hard to get something off the ground. I work so hard to learn how to do everything that I do with my podcast. I built teams around podcasting, the systems behind the scenes to make it run. I've hired and fired, and it's just been such a journey that when you go to let that go, your ego gets involved, and it could take 6 months, a year, sometimes multiple years before you truly say, okay, it's time to let this thing go and remake it, or let it go forever. In my case, I knew that I was just essentially putting the toy down and I was going to pick it back up later. I want to thank my friend Paul, who told me that's the beauty of podcasts is you can stop podcasting and you're still going to be getting downloads. And I recognize that on my own show. There's still people listening to older episodes, and it was cool to watch and almost give me permission to say, you know what, I'm just going to take 1 quarter off and reevaluate where I'm going to go for the rest of the game. And this time I'm going to put less pressure on myself to even think past what I just want to be doing in this current moment. I'm not going to ask myself, what does this need to be 5, 10, 20 years down the road? It's literally purely going to be driven by what am I motivated by right now to put out, and how do I feel like I can help the world in a solo fashion with my wife, and then with more digital guests than I have done in the past. So the immediate next step is building out those processes and getting them situated so that I can do this in a frictionless way. And then once that happens and I start getting this thing going, I'm going to be looking at different data points within the categories that I love to talk about, and how are they being valuable to other people? Because one of the things that Thrive on Life was built off of is helping other people thrive. And if I'm not conscious at any given moment of if the conversations that I'm having on this show aren't valuable to other people, then I need to redirect them in the direction that they are. So I'm very conscious of that at all times. Sometimes that can be to a detriment, but right now the focus is getting the system up, and then it'll go into what topics can I talk about that are relevant to the people that I really want to build a community with. And that's where I'm going to wrap this show based around that. Who I want to connect with is other men and women that are really pushing the needle in their own lives. They don't just want to survive. They want to thrive. They are telling themselves that. They might not know how. They might not know who's exactly going to help them get there. And they might not know exactly what it is, but they know deep down in their heart of hearts that there's this life that they want to be living, and they're going to keep wandering until they find it. And they're not scared to have a misstep. They're not afraid to look stupid. They're willing to take risk and go into new environments, meet new people, and learn new things. That's the type of person that I really want to speak to. And above and beyond that, it's new fathers, men who want to become fathers, men who've been fathers and feel that they have something to offer the world to all the other men out there that are striving to be the best dads that they can be. And the other half of that is husbands. It's guys that want to be the best husband that they could be for their wife. And you could flip that to moms and wives, because this podcast, one of the reasons I'm going to love moving forward is having my wife on here. We're going to speak to men and women. And we want to build a community of people that do exactly what I just mentioned. They live a life in a way that's more than just surviving. So looking forward to pumping out more episodes, connecting with more people. If you have any ideas for me or topics that you think that I should run through, please reach out to me. I'd love to speak with you. But until next time, this is CJ Finley with the Thrive on Life podcast. Thrive on, y'all.